Shortly before the last election, Ed Miliband said he'd rather see a Conservative majority government than a Labour SNP coalition. Were you to be the Labour leader in 2020, a week before that election, would you be saying the same thing?
No, I wouldn't. I would be saying that I want there to be a Labour majority government. If there isn't a Labour majority, but a minority, and we've got to work with other parties, probably on the basis of a day-to-day arrangement or an arrangement through what's called supply arrangement, then do that. And obviously you have to work with other parties to get things through. And I would be prepared to do that.
When you look at the MPs, let's say to your ideological left, or not to your left necessarily, but to the left of where the centre of the Labour Party is right now, you look at Mary Black, you look at Caroline Lucas, clearly a range of views, but to the left of the centre of the Labour Party, surely you see people like Black, you see people like Lucas, and then you look to your right, you see some colleagues who I won't name. Do you ever ask yourself if you're in the right party over the course of the last 3 decades?
I've often been completely at odds with the direction that the leaders of my party have taken us, particularly Tony Blair over Iraq and particularly over the strategy of private finance initiative and privatisation. But I also look at the origins of our party. I look at the people that vote Labour. I look at the hopes of a lot of people who've been treated very badly by society having Labour. It's up to us to make Labour deliver for them. So I've stayed in the Labour Party and always argued the case for a differing approach, as I'm doing at the moment.
You've previously come out against proportional representation. How can a system which gives 2 MPs to parties which have gained 4.5 million votes be defended? Because for a lot of people, that's a pretty undemocratic way of forming governments.
Well, we have a party system in Britain, and that's how most of these things are measured. Look at it another way. We have a House of Commons that's elected from 657 different constituencies across the whole of Britain. But I take your point about the representation of political views as a generality. My view is that firstly, we should keep the constituency system and so ensure that every area has somebody who is their MP. Yeah. I think that's important. Yeah. How you deal with the inequalities in this, there's a number of ways. One is to have an additional member system or a regional additional member system so that you would have a group of MPs who don't represent a constituency but would be additional members from a different part of the from whatever in the political spectrum, so it would balance things up. This happens in the London Assembly elections, it happens in Germany and a number of other places. The other is to have a democratically elected upper chamber, which would be based on regional voting, so to ensure that there is therefore a direct regional representation into the upper chamber, and that could be done entirely by proportional representation, would therefore never be controlled by any one party, but would have to be a place that you'd argue your causes through. I want to see a constitutional convention set up now in opposition, which would look, yes, at the issues of electoral representation, would also look at the voting age, look at the voting system, the rights to vote, such as the way in which European nationals resident in Britain cannot vote. Commonwealth citizens can vote, and I would certainly want to keep that. And Irish citizens can vote, as can British citizens in Ireland. I'd absolutely want to keep that. We also want to look at the question of the differing powers and financing of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the operation of the Barnett formula, whether or not it shouldn't be better based on levels of poverty in Scotland rather than more generally on population and area, and also the question of English regional government. The government at the moment is pursuing a policy of supporting a degree of localisation through Greater Manchester, Leeds and Newcastle and Cornwall, but if that's to happen, then any national service devolved to any region has to be fully funded. Otherwise we end up with the destruction of precious institutions like the National Health Service.
Last year, 4,000 undocumented migrants died crossing a land or sea border. 3/4 of them were in the Mediterranean that we know of, potentially more. Were you to be Prime Minister, or even as Leader of the Opposition, how can you, and Britain more generally, create some kind of solution to the crisis in the Mediterranean?
I raised the issue in Parliament. I think I was probably the first MP to do so, the question of the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. The migrant crisis in general, not just in the Mediterranean, but all across the Middle East. The numbers of migrants from Afghanistan who are trying to get to Australia, and numbers of other people. There are more people seeking a place of safety in the world than at any time in recorded history. And when the issue came up in Parliament before the summer recess, I did say then to the Prime Minister that we had to take an initiative in the UN in looking at the migrant crisis, looking at the support that's needed, and looking at the stability that's needed in those countries concerned. And so, in part, some of those migrants are victims of the Iraq War, some of those are Palestinians, some are from Syria, a lot from Syria. There are a large number who are trying to cross the Mediterranean to get to a place of safety. It's too easy to blame the traffickers and the people smugglers. They are merely leeching on the misery of people that is already there. We've got to be able to offer people a place of safety as a humanitarian response is required. And that means putting resources, every country, into supporting refugees in Libya, supporting refugees in Jordan and Lebanon are done at the moment, but also trying to bring about some kind of ceasefire and peace process that will enable people to return home. The idea that you can deal with this migrant crisis by either offshoring into Papua New Guinea of what Australia is doing, or putting the Navy into the seas of the Mediterranean is simply not acceptable. These are human beings who are utterly desperate and should be supported.
Harmondsworth and Yarlswood immigration detention centres. Were you to become Prime Minister, would you shut them down? How quickly would you shut them down?
I am worried and always have been and complained about the way these detention centres work. I'm unpersuaded that we need to detain migrants in this way because they haven't committed a crime other than trying to survive. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's going to end up settling everywhere else. It doesn't mean any of that. But it means that the harsh regime that we've adopted in those places is simply wrong. I don't want us to have these immigration detention centres. We managed to more or less end the detention of children, but then we discovered it didn't really end at all. I want to end that.
So if you were Prime Minister, it's fair to say, with a majority, that Yarlswood, Harmondsworth...
I would like to see them closed down. I would like to see them closed down, yes.
Are the Metropolitan Police Service racist?
There are problems in the Metropolitan Police, and the Macpherson inquiry, which to his credit Jack Straw initiated over the Stephen Lawrence murder, was very interesting, and it showed the systemic racism that was there and the institutional racism that was there. And I think Macpherson was interesting and did a good job and did quite a lot to change attitudes in the police force. I think there needs to be far better training, far closer control, and the Mayor of London and the London Assembly have a very big job on in controlling all aspects of what the Metropolitan Police does. There were times in the past when the Metropolitan Police was a far worse place than it is now. I remember in the 80s accompanying black families to police stations when they wanted to report a crime because they felt unsafe going on their own. I don't think we're quite in that situation at the moment, but we've got a very long journey to take. And the cuts in the police force, the cuts in community policing have created a much worse atmosphere. When Ken Livingstone brought in the community policing initiative, the ward-based Safer Neighbourhoods project was, I think, a very good process, and certainly I found in my own constituency the fact we had 8 local police teams meant they were far more accountable on the ground, far more in touch, and things got a lot better, and they were certainly a force for good in the community.
You've said there should be a constitutional convention. Would you include policing in that constitutional convention?
Yes, because policing at the moment is a combination of the Met Police, which is a slight anomaly because it has national policing functions, the Association of Police Chief Officers, an important part of that, and then of course there's the different county forces across the UK. I think people's human rights are important. I think remaining in the European Convention is very important. Defending the Human Rights Act is important, but also the democratic control of policing is very important.
Bill de Blasio won the morality of New York. A huge mandate for him. He said he would get rid of stop and frisk. He said it was racist policing in action. We've got stop and search in this country. It's well established that it has an element, at least, which is indisputable, of racial profiling. The question is to what extent. Do you think that stop and search is racist?
If carried out in the wrong way, yes. I started in the...
At present, is it carried out in the wrong way?
I started in the 1970s in Haringey, very concerned about the use of sus laws and stop and search, and I have constantly raised issues of stop and search. I don't think you can ever say to the police you cannot ever stop and search somebody. They may have very good reason to believe somebody's carrying a gun or a knife or fleeing a scene of a crime. I think they have to have good reason, they have to report it, they have to record it, and they have to be monitored for racial profiling of what goes on. There are suspicions that in some cases an excessive number of black youths are stopped, whereas white youths are not. There's also an excessive number of young Muslims stopped while others are not, and so there should not be any racial motive behind it, and police officers have got to get that. So it also comes into the question of training and attitudes of individual police officers.
Sure, but when you've got some data out there saying that you're 38 times more likely, now that was off a small data set,
yes,
you're 38 times more likely to be stop and searched if you're black than if you're white. To people watching this, people who've seen you out there who support you from black and minority ethnic communities, training doesn't sound like it's good enough. 38 times is a hell of a lot.
Training is part of it for the longer term, but more immediately you go to each one of those officers that stopped each one of those people and said, explain why you selected those 3 black youngsters on their way home from school for stop and search, what possible motive was behind it. It's up to the police and the police authorities to put pressure all the way through the system.
You've been quite clear that you think that if you headed up a Labour majority government or a coalition government which was led by Labour after 2020, that the best way to deal with the deficit would be through, let's say, Keynesian ideas, Keynesian processes. You'd have investment-led growth. For some people out there, some within the climate justice community, growth's completely at odds with ideas of ecological sustainability. Do you reconcile those ideas of high growth, growing the economy, jobs and wage growth for the average man and woman in this country? Do you think that's at odds with saving the environment?
Well, it's 2 things. It's about greater equality as well. So I'd be looking at closing the tax havens and the tax loopholes and the tax dodging, which amount to at least 50 billion a year.
But on that subject of growth?
I was coming on to that. On the subject of economic growth, growth of itself does not have to mean more pollution, does not have to mean more destruction. It can be greater efficiency in what you do. It can be the development of very high technology industries which are making more fuel efficient vehicles, more fuel efficient planes, more fuel efficient ships. It can be a question of how you rebalance your agriculture so it is less destructive of the environment. There are a lot of areas that you can change things. In fact, you get more people working on environmentally sustainable projects than the other way around.
I mean, one can imagine that in the short term, we'd have some kind of Keynesian stimulus, it would create jobs, increase wages, help growth in renewable industries, high-tech manufacturing and so on. But in the longer term, it's clear that the whole ideology behind growth, behind GDP effectively, is at odds with climate justice, isn't it?
It doesn't have to be, because you could also factor into your measurements.
So you're saying you'd have something different, wouldn't just be exclusively GDP when we're talking about how do we judge the success?
You have to judge things on a number of ways. GDP is one quite crude but actually quite simple form of measurement. I would also judge things like the levels of inequality in your society, the levels of poverty, the levels of pollution within your cities and in your areas, and the levels of biodiversity in the natural world around you. You have a more complex, but more inclusive set of calculations.
So would the ONS and the OBR be looking at statistics other than GDP at every budget after 2020?
They certainly would. I want the OBR and OBS to be looking at a whole lot of statistics, including land use, including biodiversity. I'd want them to be looking at a whole lot of questions about waste disposal, about energy consumption, about energy efficiency. And couldn't we be proud of saying, well, this year we've used 10% less electricity, we've got a greater level of biodiversity, our rivers are cleaner, more people are in work, and there are more electric vehicles on the road, and there are less cars in all the big cities. Those kind of things would be quite exciting. You don't have to measure everything by the ability of the super rich to buy Rolex watches.
You released your Working with Women document yesterday. Fantastic document. You talk in that document about everyday sexism. How big a problem is everyday sexism in Britain in 2015, and what's the role of government in dealing with it?
Well, legislation can set a general framework of how people want to behave. I remember when the Labour government of the 60s wanted to introduce the Race Relations Act. I was a young kid at the time, and I remember quite racist remarks being made by an awful lot of people saying, how can you possibly do that? It's normal, isn't it, to be racist about other people? Is it? Is it normal? No, of course it's not. But by setting a benchmark of saying we are, as a society, going to outlaw racism, albeit then in a very weak form, it tends to set a parameter by which people are expected to behave and do behave in general. Is there everyday sexism in Britain? Yes. Is there everyday gender discrimination? Yes. How do you deal with it? You deal with it by audits of pay, you deal with it by audits of regulation, you deal with it by simply saying it's not acceptable on television, radio and newspapers to denigrate women. Things do change as a result of it, and my proposals there are on specific areas of economic policy, but they're also on the question generally of the kind of attitudes government can set.
In that same Working with Women document, and now I'm going to quote here, you say, women do the lion's share of all care work. Unpaid care in this country is a major issue. Women who are caring for children, older and disabled people with no remuneration whatsoever. This needs to be fully recognised and valued as skilled work, which is why we must oppose George Osborne's attack on tax credits. Surely then, if you believe all that, in addition to tax credits, we should be talking about remunerating that work. How would we pay carers? Some people think the solution to care work and a number of other things beside it is introducing a guaranteed social wage. Would a guaranteed social wage solve the kinds of problems you've outlined in that document yesterday?
I'm interested in the idea of a guaranteed social wage. It's quite complicated and not particularly simple to introduce, but I'm interested in the idea behind it. But I think in the meantime we do have carers allowances. They're often quite difficult to access and quite difficult to get, and we should be supportive of that and recognise that it is women who often do a great deal of the care work. We have a system of adult social care which simply is not adequate to the needs at the present time.
Final question. You first came to Parliament in 1983. 2 years earlier, François Mitterrand came to power on a platform of redistribution, Keynesian stimulus, growth, economic justice. He had to go back on that because of inflation, because the markets were worried. Fast forward to 2015, similar-ish things are happening with Alexis Tsipras in Greece. For a lot of people out there, they say the kinds of economic platform you're advancing, the kind of agenda you're advancing, the second you're in power, there's capital flight, markets will attack the pound, it's just not sustainable in a globalised world economy. What's your answer to them?
My answer to that is, what I'm suggesting is, I think, good for the people who are suffering in this country and is good for the rest of the world. Are there going to be problems with capital movements and capital flight? Possibly, but
That's inevitable, isn't it? It's inevitable if you're Prime Minister.
We are dealing with an issue in the world where there is far too little accountability of global corporations. We're about to make it worse through the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership by empowering global corporations. We have to use the levers of power we've got, such as the Bank of England, in order to regulate the system and regulate the banking system. And we also have to say, hang on, we live in a democracy. And if the people of this country have voted for an economic strategy which is about redistribution of wealth, is about improving the living standards of those on average or lower wages.
But since the mid-1970s, since we had a crisis in the mid-1970s, that's just not good enough. This would happen if you were to become leader, and the left doesn't seem to have come up with a strategy in response to it since Mitterrand. Tsipras certainly didn't.
Tsipras took over a very difficult situation, and the European Central Bank showed all its claws in trying to ensure the banking system was fully supported, gave the Greek government a bailout which went straight back to the banks, and unemployment in Greece has gone up as a result of it. At some point in the next 5 years, the European Central Bank might begin to realise the appalling error of its ways, of the anger of the people of Greece when it tries the same tactics on Spain, Portugal and Italy. I've got a feeling there's going to be much stronger popular anti-austerity movements all across Europe in the next 5 years. Things are not going to be the same in 2020 as they are now. Trust me.
On that note, thank you very much, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Cheers.